we spend $4.2 trillion on healthcare in the United States. It's actually like a laughable number if it were funny, but it's not, because it's 20% of the largest GDP in the world, and our life expectancy is going down, and 6 in 10 American adults have a chronic disease, and 30% of teens have prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, and 20% of kids have fatty liver disease, and it's just not going well.
In this episode, we have Dr. Ketone-IQ, who is a Stanford-trained physician and chief medical officer and co-founder of metabolic health company Levels. Her mission is to maximize human potential and reverse the epidemic of preventable chronic disease by empowering individuals with tech-enabled tools that can inform smart, personalized, and sustainable dietary and lifestyle choices. Dr. Means' perspective has been recently featured in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, The New Yorker, Men's Health, Women's Health, and more. So stay tuned and enjoy this episode. Hello, Casey. Dr. Casey Means, thank you very much for coming on to Health via Modern Nutrition podcast. Happy to see you again.
It is so good to see you.
So, guys, if you're listening, if you're watching, we are doing a special sort of feature today in today's episode, especially if you're watching, because Dr. Casey Means here, she is also the CMO of Levels. And for those of you who do not know, we'll talk about it later. It's basically a company that has continuous glucose monitoring. And right now, what Dr. Means is doing is essentially showing you how to set up the CGM.
Amazing. Okay, so I think this is going to be great for people watching on YouTube, because I'm going to put on a new sensor. So I am using the Dexcom G6 sensor. I'm holding up the applicator right here. And the first thing that you'll notice is there's a barcode on the little area where the applicator is going to be. So you actually take your smartphone and you scan that barcode. So I'm going to do that.
This is VIP level treatment because we're getting the CMO to essentially demo the product.
The process.
Not many people get this.
We have an alcohol swab here. And so this is going to be the first time I'm going to put this on without a mirror. I'm doing it in front of the camera. So I'm going to clean off the back of my arm, get that area nice and sterilized and sanitized, peel off the paper from the sensor that had the barcode on it, and then this is a sticky area that's going to go on the back of my arm, and then when I put the sensor on, there'll be a small filament that actually goes under the skin and is going to be what measures my glucose. Okay, so I'm going to let that dry. 1, 2, 3. All done.
Click.
Painless.
That's it.
Totally painless.
Yep, and I already have mine here, just for the record.
I'm going to put the transmitter on.
So what we're doing today is essentially not only showing you how to put on a CGM, but also actually measuring both our glucose levels before and after Ketone-IQ. Because if you heard me talking a lot on this podcast or on external podcasts, I talk a lot about the glucose lowering effect of Ketone-IQ. Today, you are seeing it live and see how Ketone-IQ affect your blood glucose while ketones does drop your blood glucose, and you will find it that your energy level doesn't drop. And then you can also judge from Casey and my reactions throughout this episode, and we'll measure our glucose again at the end and see where we are.
This is so fun. I love the interactive podcast. So
yes, we all love an interactive podcast. Let's get everyone involved.
Yes.
I'm gonna scan mine just to show the before level, and that is 89.
Look at that flat curve. You're
80.
crushing it. And I'm gonna do a finger prick to check my ketones.
Yep.
So I just pricked my finger, which is so easy. So a little drop of blood, and then I've got a Keto Mojo ketone monitor, and
Dorian better get some reimbursement from this.
you can see the drop of blood here. And I was just telling Latt that I ate late last night, so I might not have many ketones this morning.
Which is great to show how much Ketone-IQ actually raised your ketone levels. And my flat line is because I haven't eaten all morning yet.
0.2.
0.2. Great. This is great. 0.2 level baseline. Yep. So let's take some ketones. I've got a shot here, Ketone-IQ.
I've got one
You
too.
can get it at all the Sprouts nationwide and also on Amazon.com and H.V.M.N.com.
Amazing. Should we take it? Cheers.
Yes. Cheers.
The new formulation is so much better tasting. I love it. I'm going to take 2 actually.
Yep.
I love it.
And the reason why Casey takes 2 is because different people, they prefer different sort of dosing and the optimal dose, or as to how they feel, when do they feel the best, based on their use cases as well. So
Is there a maximum amount that, like, can you overdo it?
yes, you can definitely overdo it. It's like overdosing yourself with glucose. It's essentially taking too much substrate and your body would just feel unwell and you would just like throw up or something. But ultimately, we tell people not to take more than 3 per day. But for a lot of our athletes, they take well more than 3 per day because they are taking it while they are on a race, while they're on, say Tour de France, cyclists. They will be taking it over a long time. So they'll take a total up to like 6 per day or 6 per 12 hours. And that's absolutely fine because even if you measure their blood glucose level, you can see that it goes up and then quickly goes back down as they're burning through the ketones as they exercise.
Okay, that's amazing to know because sometimes I definitely will take 2 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon. But if you're burning through them, do you feel like then you can take more? Okay, got it.
And you will feel it as well. If you are actually overdosing it, you genuinely do not feel well. And we've seen that in our study with the military where we use ketone ester, and it's really, really easy for ketone ester to overspike your blood ketone levels, especially if you take a high dosage. So a lot of these military people, because we're using weight match dosing, and they're heavier guys, like huge guys, so they're taking like 4 or 5 doses, and their ketone levels go up to 6, 7, 8 millimolar, and that's when they just feel unwell, and they report those events as well.
Super interesting.
So before we go into the meat of the episode, I also want to mention that Levels were kind enough to give you guys a special offer. So check them out at levels.link/HVMN. And I'll mention again at the end, and I will also put that in the show notes.
Perfect.
All right. So for people who do not know you, Casey, please introduce yourself, what you do, and what Levels do.
Absolutely. So my name's H.V.M.N. I am the co-founder and chief medical officer of Levels. And Levels is a health technology company that utilizes continuous glucose monitoring and intelligent software to really close the loop between what people are eating and how they're living and what the immediate effect on their metabolism and blood sugar is. And our mission is to reverse the metabolic disease epidemic, which we know is affecting the majority of Americans today. And we're doing this by giving people more access to data so they can understand their metabolic health and make better personalized choices.
And this is such a topic. This is a topic so close to my heart because growing up with a family with high prevalence of diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, and then ended up studying, doing a PhD in cardiac metabolism in the type 2 diabetic heart in hypoxia, that has always been my passion. So thank you so much for, really pushing the advancement of both the technology and the science to help people better themselves and improve their metabolic health.
Thank you so much. I love your company. I love your team. We're really on the sort of 2 sides of the coin of metabolic health with ketones and glucose. So
we've got data collection, we've got monitoring, and then we've got intervention, right?
Yep.
So, as we were talking about giving people data, so I remember when I was working for a diabetes management program, we found that the data, the more people measure their weight, the more people monitor their own weight, the higher likelihood it is for people to lose weight because it gives them motivation. Is that still hold true?
That is such an interesting, great point. And actually one that we're starting to see in our data set. We have had tens of thousands of people go through the Levels program at this point, and many of them have opted in to do a research study with Levels that has been ongoing for about a year. And some of the preliminary data that we're starting to see but have not published yet is that for people who start the Levels program with an elevated BMI, and obviously we know BMI has some flaws to it, but for people who are above a BMI of 30, when they start levels, people are just by the nature of tracking their glucose levels, dropping an average of 10 pounds. And some people are losing up to 80 pounds or more. So it's a large spectrum, but essentially as weight is higher, or BMI is higher when starting the program, the more likely people are to lose weight. And the Levels program is not a weight loss intervention program. It's really a metabolic awareness program. People are making their own decisions. They're, interpreting their data with the help of our app, but just by tracking these things, and it's not even tracking weight, it's tracking glucose, people are losing weight, which is a really exciting early signal that I hope we can build upon. And then you can imagine if you coupled that with, even more of a comprehensive weight loss strategy program, it might even accelerate the results. One other thing we've seen, getting at what you were just talking about, was that the more people log meals and the longer time they use the sensor, so more than 1 month, into 2, 3, 4 months, the more weight that they seem to be losing. So just by being cognizant of those meals, putting them in a tracker, it seems to be correlated with increased weight loss. So again, this is super preliminary data. It's observations we're seeing from our data set, but I think it's really exciting because, of course, our country is dealing with a monumental obesity crisis right now, and interventions that are empowering and natural and sustainable and not restrictive, I think, are things we really need to lean into from a public health standpoint.
That is super interesting, and it'll be even more interesting when you get more data and really figure out what is the psychological shift there that makes people more motivated or makes people change their lifestyle habits and then achieve those results.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we're so excited about this study because I think we're going to be able to really push the envelope on generating some of that data.
When can we look forward to this study being published?
It's going to be an ongoing long-term study. And so, we're going to be, dripping out info probably over the next, 6 to 12 months.
Okay, so you shared a little bit of tidbits on this preliminary data, what you guys found. Any other highlights that you would like to really focus on and let our audience know what can they do in order to improve their metabolic health, whether from a monitoring point of view or even just activity point of view?
It's such a great question. And a lot of it actually comes down to the basics and really confirming the basics. One of the biggest things that we have seen in our data set is that taking a walk after a meal has a significant positive impact on lowering glucose levels compared to a meal without a walk afterwards. So this is one that you can just keep in your back pocket and it's supported by, of course, peer-reviewed data showing that walks after meals is really effective at improving glucose levels. But now also in this larger real world population, we're starting to see this. We did a small experiment with the Levels team actually like years ago that kind of kicked this off, which showed that if you drank a can of Coca-Cola, so 12 ounces of Coke, with a walk afterwards or without a walk afterwards, there was actually about a 35% decline in peak glucose levels. So the average without the walk was 162 milligrams per deciliter, which is a very high spike. And with just a simple walk after the can of Coke was around 132 milligrams per deciliter. So that's a 30-point drop. And you can imagine over the course of a lifetime, that's a really big change in what your blood vessels and what your body are being exposed to in terms of glucose concentrations. Because we know, the more glucose that's floating around in the bloodstream for longer periods of time, it's a problem. That glucose is going to stick to things and cause glycation, which can lead to dysfunction. It can trigger inflammation. It can trigger oxidative stress. It's going to cause more insulin to be released to get that glucose out of the bloodstream. So using your muscles and soaking up glucose out of the bloodstream and actually using the glucose and really processing it through activity is really this magic bullet. And so I think that one of the big key takeaways I've seen is that moving more throughout the day in these sort of periods like after meals or, in between meetings is really profound for just keeping this constant signal to the body to take glucose out of the bloodstream. So that's one learning that we've seen reflected in our data set. The second one is just really around breakfast. I think that we see such a delta in breakfast responses between what I would consider sort of standard American comfort food breakfast, things like pastries and donuts and bagels and toast and juice and things we've really normalized in culture as breakfast foods, muffins. These have some of the highest spikes in our entire data set, probably unsurprisingly. Obviously, they're refined white flour, grain-based products that usually have added refined sugar. But when you see that compared to what is more of a savory breakfast, so things like eggs and avocado, and these are sort of logs that I'm mentioning here. So eggs and avocado, eggs and greens, frittata, chia pudding. These things have very, very low spiking potential. And so I just look at the data and think, oh my gosh, if we could just get Americans to focus on breakfast foods that were more savory, eliminated the refined grains and refined added sugars, you're just starting your day in a completely different biologic state if you can shift to a more savory, whole foods, unprocessed breakfast and just set yourself up for such a better and more stable day with better metabolic parameters and better metabolic health.
Those are such great advice, Casey. Thank you so much. I'm personally more of a savory guy, so it's easy for me to go through, eggs and avocados and all that versus the sweets. And do you know that you probably have just created one of the most viral H.V.M.N moment when you talk about the Coke, because it's so relatable, and we'll cut that for sure, make them social clips, and people can actually share that, what they can do after they drink a can of Coke, after they have a meal, for example. But one thing, let's go specific here. Is there any specific guideline on how long should that walk be, or how fast and how intense that walk should be?
Yeah. I think the first thing to remember is that the vast majority of people are just not doing any movement after a meal. So it's the first thing I would say is don't overthink the protocol. Just move your body. I don't care if it's a walk or squats in the kitchen or a dance party, with your family after a meal. Just the key is to activate large muscle groups in the body in some way so that they soak glucose out of the bloodstream. So don't get too worried about, I think, the protocols. But when you actually do look at the data, you want to probably take the walk within 30 minutes of finishing your meal, because that's when you're going to start to get that really high slope of the curve of the glucose going up in the bloodstream. So you want to kind of catch it before you're signaling that huge insulin release, because muscle is so amazing in that it can actually take glucose out of the bloodstream without insulin. And that's such a superpower, because if you can just soak that glucose up without triggering the body to produce so much insulin, it's going to be better for your insulin sensitivity over the long run. So within 30 minutes after the meal, and I would say, as brisk as you can, you just push yourself to get the muscles working. The more you work them, the more you're going to pull out the glucose out of the bloodstream. So I think a 15-minute walk can be plenty effective. So the way this might play out is, let's say you're having Thanksgiving dinner with the family, everyone wraps up, and maybe people are having a slice of pie. Before you go in to clear the dishes and do the dishes, someone be that person at the dining room table who says, guys, it's such a beautiful evening outside. Let's take a quick walk around the block and continue this conversation while we're moving. And I think you'll find that a lot of people will be super up for it. But you kind of gotta push the envelope a little bit and encourage people. And then once people are up and about, they usually love it. I've been astounded with my family how once you kind of get this habit going, people really look forward to it. And it's just so nice to get some fresh air and move around a little bit.
What do you mean walk around? You mean I can't tend to my food coma while I'm in bed right after Thanksgiving meal?
There's a time and place for that, of course, but I'm all about like focusing on how your body feels. It's just amazing. Like we might think that like just curling up and laying around is like feels the best, but then when you're actually out and about kind of moving your body, it's just incredible how your mood feels good and everyone's happy. Yeah,
That was all jokes, guys. But now, I know that there are a lot of audience on our platform as well who are either on keto diet or low carb diet. And we talked about the walk being very helpful after you've taken in a carb loaded meal. Would that walk also benefit people who are not going to see a spike in glucose, i.e. if they're on keto diet or low carb diet?
I think a walk after a meal is going to be good for anyone, no matter what macronutrient ratio you're following. Muscles are magic. Muscle activation is medicine. When we activate our muscles, we release myokines, which can be anti-inflammatory and pro-metabolic health generally. And so every time you're doing something to activate your muscle groups, no matter what you're eating, you're basically feeding your body with biochemical signals that are going to make your life happier, healthier, and longer. So it just doesn't really matter. I just finished writing my first book, and I think one of the biggest takeaways that I got from digging so deep into the research for so many months was that we're almost a little backwards, I think, in our relationship to this concept of exercise. I'm starting to think more and more that the concept of exercise is almost like a gimmick. We spend more on exercise products and gym memberships than almost any country in the entire world by like a huge margin, and yet we are one of the sickest and heaviest countries in the Western world. And when you look at more traditional cultures throughout history who have not dealt with chronic disease or obesity epidemics, what you find is that movement is just built into all aspects of lifestyle, from the work that we do to leisure activities,
to gardening,
and actually even acquiring food. And so it's estimated that many, indigenous traditional cultures were walking 20,000 steps a day just because of the way they lived. They weren't trying to take any of those steps. They weren't necessarily tracking those, but
they didn't have to pay hundreds of dollars either.
It was free, right? And the average American now is taking about 3,800 steps a day. So it's just completely different physiologic conditions in the body and so much less muscle activation. And so I think a big thing that I think a lot about is how do you actually just structure your life in this modern, wonderful world that we're living in that just does happen to really promote sedentary behavior? How do you build in movement really naturally into that? And there's a concept called NEAT, which is this sort of non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which is about basically like how do you just build in non-exercise movement throughout your day. And there's just so many examples of this, like you just said, gardening, parking farther away from the store and walking more, fidgeting even at your desk if your leg is kind of moving up and down. That can burn many, many calories in the day. Having a treadmill desk, doing squats in between your meetings, taking a walk with a friend instead of going and sitting and having coffee. So not actually discrete exercise, but just movement throughout the day. And the impact of these activities in dozens and dozens and dozens of studies have shown that it's good for metabolic health, it's good for weight, and it's actually good for mood. So I would really encourage anyone to sit down honestly with their journal and just think about your day from the minute you wake up to the minute you go to sleep. Where are there maybe 5 opportunities to just build more movement into a time when you're normally sitting, and just start to really get creative?
That is amazing. And to that point as well, movement, whether you are having a glucose spike or not, you are also aiming to lower your insulin as much as possible. And know that even if you're on a low carb diet or a keto diet, proteins also increase insulin to a certain extent. although not as high as glucose would. So that movement and that exercise would also keep that insulin as low as possible, as at the same time also activating all these metabolic pathways in order to burn whatever substrate that you just put into your body. So don't think that just because you're on a keto diet, or if you are doing low carb, you don't need to exercise in order to get into a good metabolic health state.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to insulin sensitivity, it fundamentally comes down to how effective our mitochondria are functioning. Because if the mitochondria are not functioning properly, it's going to send a signal to the cell to really block the intracellular insulin signaling pathway and lead to insulin resistance. So when I think about mitochondrial health, it really comes down to the concept use it or lose it. If you're not using these beautiful machines in our cell that create cellular energy and not pushing them to actually do the work they need to do and supporting them with all aspects of your lifestyle, they are going to become damaged through processes like oxidative stress and become less functional. And that's going to lead to that insulin resistance that's causing most of the issues in our modern American healthcare environment. And so really it's about thinking like, with all aspects of my diet, lifestyle, and movement routines, how am I actually stimulating my mitochondria to do more work? Because that's going to basically be that little push to tell them to be, more effective at their jobs. And then with all the other aspects of diet and lifestyle, how do I support the mitochondria to thrive? So that an example of that be like, give it the micronutrients it needs to do its work, the cofactors for the electron transport chain, the final process of making ATP, keeping chronic stress levels down, because we know that chronic cortisol signal is going to hurt the activity of the mitochondria. So it's both pushing it to be as efficient and effective as possible, and then supporting it with all the things it needs to actually thrive. Like, I love this concept that I'm thinking a lot about is like this sort of self that we are, this sort of like overarching human being that is made up of 30, 40, 50 trillion cells. The self, the purpose of it is actually to protect all of those 37 trillion cells inside our bodies and almost like be the parent for all those cells. And even more importantly, be the parent for all those little mitochondria that are trying so hard to animate your life and give you the energy to live the happiest life possible. So it's like you support and protect these little guys inside your cell, and they will create the energy for you to make your life wonderful. So it's this fabulous crosstalk between you and your cells. And fundamentally, it comes down to making choices that push your mitochondria to do their best work and support them with the things they need to thrive. And when you do that, your insulin will automatically be lower because you're freeing up the cell to basically be insulin sensitive. So it's just a fascinating crosstalk. But every pillar of diet and lifestyle, so like stress management, good sleep, moving, healthy diet, supporting our microbiome, exposing ourselves to cold, avoiding environmental toxins. We talk about all these different things and it can seem overwhelming, but fundamentally all of them are focused on creating an environment in which our metabolic powerhouses, our mitochondria, can do their best work. And moving is one of the best signals we can do for that.
So when is this concept that you just explained in terms of the mitochondria and the parenting and all of that turning into a movie? I can see that into turning into an animation or a series. That would be really interesting.
I think it would. I think we need to, I think the healthcare system has been really damaging in the sense that it's been so patronizing to patients in almost making them feel like it's too hard to understand your own body. It's also complicated. The Krebs cycle, the citric acid cycle, it's also complicated. It's actually not that complicated. And we all have the ability to understand some of these basic concepts. And I think the more that we do and understand why we're investing in all these different health behaviors, it actually will just create so much more of an empowered world that can really focus on their health and improve their own health and not be so reliant and dependent on a system that essentially profits off our own ignorance of our bodies. And so, yeah, that's what I'm really passionate about. And I would love to see like animations and more movies that really help people understand this concept of what is really going on in the cell that is core and fundamental to our health, because when you get metabolic health right, everything else in your life gets easier. There's virtually no problem in the world with our individual human lives or even on a societal level that cannot get better if you've got humans in that system that have better metabolic health. When our cells are powered properly, when our life force is strong, which is metabolism, we have a more functional society, we have happier people, we have smarter people, we have healthier people, the economy will be better. And so that's obviously, there's so many ways to improve society and improve health, but my particular focus is improving metabolic health because I believe it's the lowest hanging fruit possible to improve a thriving society.
This is preach. I mean, you said it so well. You said it so well, Casey. And that's also why we're doing what we're doing, right? Because we want to communicate, we want to educate, and I am trying to improve myself day over day to really simplify all these different complicated pathways and trying to make it more relatable and understandable for the public, because right now everyone thinks science and metabolic health is such a complicated concept that only when I am in trouble that I have the interest and passion to understand it, but not that's not the case. Like, you need to understand it before you get into trouble, because there are so many things that are preventable that you don't even need to go into that realm of increased risk until you have to actually delve into that area. You know what I mean? So definitely really resonate with me, with us. And I think that's what Levels and H.V.M.N are such good friends, because we strive for the same vision and mission to really help people with metabolic health. And since we're on the topic of molecular biology and like the pathways and all of that, I want to ask you, based on your experience, your background as MD, and the data set that you have seen in Levels, what comes first, like insulin resistance or the elevated glucose, right? This is always the topic of discussion and debate. What causes the insulin resistance and, the spikes of the glucose? Which one is worse? Is it the insulin? Is it the glucose? What do you think?
It's a great question. And I'm not like the person who has the single one answer. I think that we all are coming at this through the lens of what research we've dived into and what our current conception is. But I'll share with you what my framework is based on the work that I've done, which is that it is fundamentally a problem with the mitochondria that ultimately leads to insulin resistance, which then leads to a compensatory hyperinsulinemia and the blocking of glucose from getting into cells, which then, of course, causes glucose to rise in the bloodstream. So fundamentally, it's a problem inside the cell that can be caused by many different things, many different vectors of our environment that causes basically a block that then leads to glucose elevating. Now, the nuance to this is that one of those things that can hurt the mitochondria and cause it to be less functional is excess glucose coming into the system. And so it's bi-directional, but I think there's definitely been a movement over the past few years as metabolic health has become more of a topic that more people are understanding of, it's this simplification of it's glucose spikes that cause insulin resistance is far too simple. It's one of the things that can cause mitochondrial dysfunction that leads to insulin resistance, but it's one of many. So when you look at all the different vectors that we know can hurt the mitochondria, lead to insulin resistance, which leads to glucose intolerance, it's things like environmental toxins. So like there's 80,000 or more synthetic chemicals in our food, water, air, personal care products, home cleaning products, furniture, electronics, cars, 80,000 synthetic toxins. And now we're learning that a huge percentage of them actually directly disrupt our mitochondrial function, or things like our epigenetics or our microbiome, which then in turn hurts our mitochondria. So like all those things, which of course have nothing to do with glucose, can damage this part of the cell, which then signals to block the intracellular signaling pathway of the insulin receptor, which then is going to make us more glucose intolerant. So you could basically be having glucose intolerance even if your diet was perfect, because you've damaged the cells because of this other non-food factor. The same is true of, for instance, like artificial light at the wrong times of day. So many of our metabolic processes are set up on a circadian rhythm and a sort of supposed to unfold throughout a 24-hour period in a very regular way. And we've got our central clock that regulates metabolic processes, which happens in our brain in the suprachiasmatic nucleus. We've got peripheral clocks in our cells, clock genes and whatnot. But all of these are synchronized and made finely tuned by the light exposure that we get. That is really the only external signal, one of the key external signals that tells our body actually what time it is. And so those photons hitting our retina in the morning help synchronize the internal clocks to basically unfold the metabolic pathways in the way that they're supposed to. The other big circadian regulators that help synchronize other than light exposure are meal timing and sleep consistency. And so let's say you're like a modern American, like many of us, who wake up, immediately sit down at our computer, never go outside before starting work, do not let those photons hit our retina, do not tell our body that it is morning through that light signal, and then stay inside maybe till noon, maybe go outside to check the mail, do an errand, get a little bit of photon energy. Totally confusing our bodies, right? Like it's morning, but we actually have not had very many photons hit our retina to tell it what time it is. And then at night, when there's supposed to be an absence of light energy hitting our retinas, we blast it with blue light from our computers, and then the body's like, wait, is it morning? I'm so confused. And so that's another sort of like meta thing happening in culture right now, where our bodies are very confused, which is definitely gonna hurt the mitochondrial function. This poor little mitochondria that's like looking for these consistent signals of like what it's supposed to do, and we're screwing up all our light hygiene. And so that could potentially contribute to insulin resistance. And of course, it's totally not food related. So to answer your question, to circle back, in terms of the chicken and the egg, more and more I'm starting to feel that the instigating factor is the confluence of things in our modern environment that damage the intracellular signaling processes and mitochondrial function, that ultimately leads to a block in insulin signaling, which then makes us extremely glucose intolerant. And like I said, one of those factors is excessive glucose. So right now, the average American is eating about 60% of their calories from ultra-processed foods, of which a huge part of that is ultra-concentrated refined sugars and this like massive glucose load that our bodies have no idea how to process all this. So you've got all this energetic substrate coming into the body in concentrations that are just astronomical. And, the cell is like, whoa, what am I supposed to do with all this? It's basically, you put all that glucose and refined grain into the body, and you're basically telling all your cells, oh my gosh, you need to work overtime and process all of this to cellular energy, glucose to ATP. But they literally can't, not only because it's too much, but also because the machine that converts this food to energy is broken because of all these other things like the light and the toxins. So you've got a broken machine being asked to do too much. So what happens? You don't convert it to ATP, you store it as fat. And so of course, now we're all gaining weight. We have intracellular fat, we have visceral fat, we have subcutaneous fat. We've got fat everywhere because we're bombarding the cells with all this extra substrate. This is why movement throughout the day is so important, because the more that you can actually process that stuff and stimulate the mitochondria to work through it, the less you're going to channel towards fat. But so that refined grain and refined sugar overload is essentially overtaxing the system, creating mass confusion, I think, in our cells, creating a lot more going to storage form, creating a lot more damaging metabolic byproducts like oxidative stress, which further damages the machinery of the cell, and then also contributes to our insulin resistance and future worsening of glucose intolerance. So to just wrap up here, I think the main environmental vectors we need to think about are food, sleep, stress management, exercise, microbiome health, light, temperature exposure, and environmental toxins. All those things have some relationship to how our mitochondria and cells thrive. And we need to basically, as adults and as humans in the modern world, take stock of those 8 different vectors and think, okay, where in my life can I optimize these? Which aspects am I doing better or worse on? Because it's going to be different for everyone. You and I are going to have different levels of optimization for each of those different things, but take stock of the ones that are most present in your life and then work to fix them. So for me, it might be that I need to get the sleep dialed in and get rid of some environmental toxins, but maybe my food is really on point. For you, it might be you need to deal with some childhood trauma and unpack that because it's creating a chronic stress signal in your life, and you need to get off the processed sugar. So everyone, it's going to be different, but it's our jobs to take stock of all those different cellularly destructive factors and create a plan to essentially free up our bodies and cells from these environmental triggers that are keeping us sick, mitochondrially dysfunctional, insulin resistant, glucose intolerant.
That is such a wonderful and wholesome answer. Thank you so much for that. No, seriously, you put it in such great detail that it's really helpful for people to understand, but also really helpful for people to take note and essentially change or know what they need to change. And I think this is also one of those moments where we as scientists, doctors, experts, as much as we would love to simplify insulin resistance and simplify these concepts and blame one single thing, oh, glucose is the cause, oh, fat is the cause, we can't, because our metabolism is that sophisticated that it is being that any factors that goes directly into the mitochondrial function is so multifaceted that it's hard to pinpoint a single reason or single factor that is causing the dysfunction. So, but one thing I know that, if I want to simplify this and put it in an analogy, it's like a factory whose workers were already overworked. They're not being clothed well. They're not being fed well. They're already tired and sick. And then you just ask them to increase their work output. What will happen? It's not going to work. It's just going to be broken altogether. So I think that's the best way to sort of describe how mitochondrial dysfunction, getting bombarded by all these different factors, toxins, and like dysregulation, nutrition, lack of activities, etc. So thank you for that.
Yeah, of course. I'm curious, you, not to turn the tables because you're the interviewer, but you've studied this so deeply. Does your framework diverge from that in any way, or is that sort of where you've landed as well? I'd be so curious.
I think it's definitely mitochondrial dysfunction. I think I wholeheartedly agree on the mitochondrial dysfunction, and I do think from a nutritional point of view, it's very much an excess of calories, regardless of whether if as excess of glucose or excess of fats. Most of the time, people with processed food, they have both high glucose, high fat diet, right? So when that happens, you are essentially shoving all these excess of substrates inside the cell. The cell has to essentially process them, but at the same time, because they are so full and the storage is so full, and then when you think about it, the majority of the calories is going to be stored in adipose tissue as fats. And when you have the overload of storage system in adipose tissue, it starts to leak out all these adipokines and diacylglyceride that will essentially drive up inflammation, and that inflammation in turns send other signals to really try to compensate. But instead of compensating, because you are constantly causing insults to the cells and the mitochondria and your body, that it, instead of compensating it, it's just becoming a vicious cycle that asks your pancreatic beta cell to secrete more insulin. There's only so much your body can do in order to filter out the insults and toxin before it's broken. So I think that's where I arrived to.
It's exactly, yeah. No, I think that's actually a really nuanced point around. It's not just the glucose and the refined carbohydrates. It's really the hyper concentration of all the substrates that the cells are being tasked to process.
And calorie dense processed food.
Exactly. Yeah. And actually that's another kind of conclusion I arrived to also after writing this book, which was that this is why our focus on unprocessed foods, and actually even more detailed than that, unprocessed whole foods grown in the best possible soil are so critically important for getting us out of this biologic crisis that we're in right now of chronic metabolic disease. And the reason is because whole unprocessed foods cue our satiety mechanisms, which are so beautifully evolved. They cue them in a much more nuanced way than ultra-processed food, which hijacks our reward circuitry and totally sort of barrels over our normal satiety cues by triggering all these other pathways like our reward and addiction circuitry, and makes us just want to eat. But if you're eating natural, unprocessed whole foods of really, and I believe, any macronutrient ratio, whether it's or even any dietary philosophy, keto, vegan, if it's unprocessed whole foods, your satiety mechanisms will be triggered and you are much less likely to overeat, which means less overall concentrated substrate for your cells to process. And so, what goes in is what you need, and you use it and you process, and there's not a lot of excess to store. There's not a bunch of excess reactive metabolic byproducts because you're overloading the system, and things start working really well again. And the reason I mentioned the soil piece is because in the food that's grown in the best possible soil, so like organic is great, regenerative is better, which basically just means like farmers that are really focused on the biodiversity of their soil and keeping it as healthy as possible. Those foods are going to have the most micronutrient, antioxidant, polyphenol, omega-3 levels, these really important other non-macronutrient, more micronutrient factors that are going to basically be like sparkle dust on the whole system to make it work better, from the microbiome level to the mitochondrial cofactor level. And so in many ways, it's just seems like such the answer is like, if you don't know what to eat, because the nutrition world is so confusing right now, just start with whole, unprocessed, natural foods, ideally like from a farmer's market, and life will just get so much easier because you will be cueing your satiety signals, you will be improving your microbiome, which in turn will make you more regulated in terms of appetite, and start taking off some of those pounding, overwhelming signals from processed foods to our cells. And again, going back to that idea of like being a parent for your cells, it's one of the most loving, protective things you can do for those 40 trillion cells is give them whole foods, because it's basically saying, you don't need to work so hard. I'm going to give you what you need. I'm going to give you stuff that will make you naturally not feel like you need to overeat and gavage yourself. And you're going to be able to kind of like take a breather and just do the work that you know how to do as well as possible.
That is such a great point, because I think there is a study that compares same calories, processed food versus whole foods, just exact same calories, but those with processed food end up eating more, just feeling more hungry over the day, just because of the compounds and the how the processed foods are being made. So that definitely contributes towards the overconsumption of foods and calories.
That's exactly right. That there was I think you're referring to a study that was done at the NIH run by Kevin Hall, which was really interesting. It was one of the most controlled nutrition studies like ever done, where basically they took people and they put them in like they were like in a prison in the NIH. Like they could not leave, they could not bring in food. And for the first 2 weeks, they gave them a processed food diet. And this is basically what you'd be getting in a school lunch or a hospital. I mean, it's just like, you think like white bread and yogurts that had processed fruit and sugar in them. So it's not like it was all just like fast food. It's just like a lot of the normal foods in America, which actually are ultra processed. Gravies that came from a package and processed deli meats and things like that. And that was for 2 weeks. And then they switched them to an unprocessed diet, which was like chicken breast and broccoli and potatoes and fruits and vegetables and omelets and things like that. So just normal American foods, but one that was unprocessed, minimally processed, and one that was processed. And on the 2 weeks where they were exposed to and they could eat however much they wanted. It wasn't calorie restricted. It was just like they could have seconds, whatever. In the 2 weeks that they were eating the processed food, people ate on average 500 calories more per day and gained, I believe, 2 kilograms. And then they lost that it might have been 2 pounds. It might have been 2 pounds, but I think it was 2.2 kilograms. And then they basically lost that during the unprocessed. So it's just 500 calories might not seem like a lot, but that's actually a huge percentage of our daily calories. And over time, of course, that's going to be the difference between like a healthy life and a not healthy life. So really fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, 500 calories, if you just times that, if you've been doing that for the past 10 years, that makes a lot of difference.
It does. And you literally, it's not like people were not trying to diet during that 2 weeks of whole foods. They literally just did not want to eat that extra 500 calories. I was just doing on my calculator, what's 500 times 365? Like it's almost 200,000 extra calories per year, which which is maybe the difference between like 50 pounds. Or, I mean, it's kind of crazy, right?
In 1 year, imagine if you've been doing that for a decade.
Right. Welcome to America.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's super interesting. So it's almost like you read my mind, Casey. Like I've got all these questions lined up and you didn't even need me to prompt them. You literally went into them like on your own, and it's great. As we were talking about, as we're wrapping up here, and we talked about insulin resistance, we talked about the importance of walk after foods to, really help with metabolic health. We talked about healthier breakfast options, savory versus sweet. And then we talked about just being a parent to your mitochondria to really foster and cultivate mitochondrial health to essentially have a very, very essential impact in your overall metabolic health. Let's pull it back to monitoring and technology and what levels it's doing. Where do you see this sort of technology heading towards, and how do you see the future being shaped up, having more monitoring tools such as CGM and companies like Levels help us arrive at those things that we talked about, like how we can, really take a step forward in the metabolic health realm?
Great question. The reason I'm so excited about monitoring things like glucose and hopefully future metabolic biomarkers really comes down to the power of curiosity and empowerment. It attracts many people, I think, because of this concept of like optimization and biohacking. But for me, it really is rooted in curiosity and awe and empowerment. Because when you can see exactly what the cause and effect is between these hundreds of choices you're making every day in your life and what it's actually doing immediately in your body, you have a much deeper understanding of the relationship to your own body, the relationship to the choices you're making, the relationship to everything around you. And from there, you can start to make empowered decisions about how you want to live your life. Think about how different that is from the normal way we're living our lives, where we are so confused. We're bombarded with marketing messages constantly. We doubt our choices. We don't understand our bodies because our doctor has all the information about our bodies. And we are constantly feeling like unclear about whether all the energy we're putting into our lives is actually having the impact we want. monitoring can cut through that. And I find that if you're empowered about how your choices are actually impacting your health and your life, it actually bleeds into a lot of other aspects of life, because empowerment begets empowerment. And feeling like you have agency over certain aspects of your life, especially ones that are notoriously confusing or cause pain and strife in your life, like nutrition or weight, I think that's like an open door to then feeling more empowered in other things in your life. So that's kind of philosophically why I'm so passionate about this. And, you know, I don't consider myself a biohacker. I don't consider myself an optimizer or a protocol type person. I'm actually a very like natural person, and I want to be away from technology, and I want to have my hands in the soil, and I want to be backpacking, and I don't want to be a bionic person. But what I am obsessed with is self-understanding, self-actualization, awe at this incredible body and human experience that we're having, and getting the most out of every single day that I have on this precious life on this precious planet. And I think that starts with understanding your body and making better choices. So that's why I love monitoring. But I think
data is objective, and it doesn't lie, right? So
exactly, yeah, and it on top of all that, of course, then there's just like the systems issues. I mean, we spend, you know, $4.2 trillion on healthcare in the United States. It's actually like a laughable number if it were funny, but it's not, because it's 20% of the largest GDP in the world, and our life expectancy is going down, and 6 in 10 American adults have a chronic disease, and 30% of teens have prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, and 20% of kids have fatty liver disease, and it's just not going well. And so the more that we can actually bring mass awareness to metabolic health, the better, you know, the future of our planet is going to be. And when you focus on this one biomarker, glucose, a lot of people might say like, well, why glucose? Like, it's just one biomarker. But the beauty of it is that it is a readout. It is a single biomarker that is a readout of very complex things going on in our lifestyle and inside of our cells. So even though it's one biomarker, it can clue you into several different things that you might need to work on or change your relationship with in your life, like sleep, stress management, toxins, etc. And so it's really an incredible biomarker for helping you sort of step back and start evaluating in your own life which areas you need to focus on. And I think that, you know, until we get our blood sugar under control in the United States, our life expectancy is going to keep going down, and our healthcare costs are going to keep going up. And the crazy thing is that what we see, and I'm sure you've had the experience, I've had this experience, our tens of thousands of members, many of them have had this experience, is that it's not that hard to figure out how to stabilize your blood sugar. If you're looking at it all day, you make slightly different choices that usually aren't that hard and usually aren't that expensive, and you can figure out how to stabilize it. But if you can't see it, how are you going to do that? So this is why I'm so passionate about it, is because people can make really rapid changes, and it actually is a lot easier than they think. And like I said, until we get more Americans with healthy blood sugar levels that aren't going up and down all day long, every day, we're going to keep having huge problems with chronic disease and reduction in longevity.
So that brings me to my next question. What's the favorite, so hypothetically, what's the favorite biomarker you would like to see next that comes to the market that people can monitor continuously? Like, I would personally love to see my cortisol level, right, if it's possible at all, because we know that if we take cortisol level in the labs, it may or may not reflect the actual levels, because our cortisol level changes very rapidly depending on the state that we're in, and depending on the activity as well. So if we can measure that as well, and we know that cortisol does lead to a lot of different risks of mental health diseases as well as metabolic diseases. Let me know your thoughts.
Yeah, I think cortisol is going to be a huge one, because I think the chronic stress element of our health cannot be understated. I think that we're facing an environmental, world in which the environment that we live in, our stress pathways are incapable, I think, of fully managing unless you're doing very deep personal work to figure out how to relate to the modern world that we're living in. If you're just kind of going along and letting the tidal wave of forces around us, media, sensationalist fear mongering, all of it, our technology, and just sort of letting it wash over you, I think that the stress pathways of the human body are just going to be naturally overwhelmed. And so I think it is possible to live a healthy way in relation to all of this, but it takes a lot of deep work to figure out, what your framework is for it, and then set up the tools and structures in your life to create boundaries around it. And I think we sort of are like, we've normalized what it feels like to feel chronic low-grade stress. And this is why I think things like potentially like psychedelics, or a lot of people are doing digital detoxes, like people are dying to feel what it feels like in their body to release that grip, even if it's only for a couple hours. And just circling back to continuous cortisol monitoring, I wonder if something like that could be a piece in the awareness conversation around like, holy moly, like this stuff is jacking me up, and I know that's not good for my health. I know that that's going to be ultimately like a catabolic, destructive force over time. And then just like with glucose, figure out what levers need to change in your life to like stabilize that. So again, it's like these things can really motivate us and then help us figure out which levers we need to pull for our own bodies. And I think that applies to the glucose conversation. It also applies to the stress. The other molecule, of course, that would be fantastic, I think, would be insulin, because, insulin changes a lot earlier than even glucose levels are going to change. Like you're going to have high insulin levels to compensate for that insulin resistance for a long period of time before your glucose levels start getting erratic, which again gets back to the chicken and the egg thing. And so knowing that early, I think, would be fantastic for everyone listening. I just plug this on any content I do, which is like, ask your doctor for a fasting insulin test and get it done, even if you have to fight for it a little bit, because you want that to be between like 2 and 6 or so, less than 6, ideally. If it's starting to creep above 8, 10, there may be that early insulin resistance brewing, even if your glucose levels look okay. So ask your doctor for that. So insulin would be great. And then these are like pipe dreams, but, I would love to see down the road monitoring of inflammatory markers and oxidative stress markers, because we know that there's this interdependent relationship between mitochondrial dysfunction, insulin sensitivity, inflammation, and oxidative stress, that all, like, if you put those on a map, there would be arrows going between all of them in every direction. They all feed into each other. And my book has a lot to do with that exact topic. We can't get into all of that today, but if you could monitor a little bit more, like how much of these damaging metabolic byproducts are actually being generated. And right now, there really aren't good tests for those, for a lot of the inflammatory markers or oxidative stress markers. So this is just for anyone listening who's a scientist coming up with some of these assays. I think that's something I would really love to see, because it truly tells us about core cellular health. And we actually can't, other than CRP, which is one inflammatory marker, and then a couple cytokines that we can measure, there's really not good inflammation or oxidative stress monitoring.
You heard it here first. So if you come up with $100 million, $1 billion company doing all these tests, don't forget us.
Any others you'd add to the list?
I think you pretty much really describe it so perfectly. I think it's a perfect storm if you have all those markers in disarray and dysregulated, because like you said, oxidative stress, mitochondrial dysfunction, insulin dysfunction, and then you get the stress hormone like the cortisol. And if we have a whole picture of that, imagine how powerful that data will be in both the intervention end, but also on the prevention end, right? Just knowing that anything spikes those levels up a little bit, and knowing that activity and allowing us to identify either the activity or the intervention that caused that, it's a game changer, right?
I would also add, like, my co-founder, Josh Clemente, who is like one of the most brilliant humans in the world. And he thinks about this continuous biomonitoring landscape more than I think anyone else in the world. But he talks a lot about, like, here's another example. So let's say you had, heart disease is the #1 killer of Americans. And right now we monitor heart disease with these like single time point measurements, maybe once a year, every 6 months at the doctor's office. But and then people have heart attacks and strokes and they die of the sequelae of these diseases. But imagine if you could have a continuous monitor that could tell you so much earlier if you were about to have a cardiac event. And this is actually totally possible. So right now, if you're having heart attack symptoms like chest pain, you go into the emergency room and they check things like a troponin level, which is basically a protein that's released from heart muscle when it's being damaged. And it's being damaged because, a heart attack is basically like lack of blood flow to the heart muscle dies, those cells will release troponin. And then that's what you measure. And if troponin is elevated, that's basic. And the EKG findings show that there's certain patterns. They say you have a heart attack. Well, what if you had someone at high risk for heart disease for a heart attack, so someone with heart disease, and they get a continuous troponin monitor. And so maybe at hours and hours before they actually have heart attack symptoms, they're already having subclinical strain on their heart. And you start getting some of that leaking of troponin before any symptoms, and it alerts them, and they can then go to the doctor's office or the hospital and potentially have an intervention or get on some sort of less invasive intervention to basically prevent the heart attack from happening. That would completely change our entire healthcare system. We would probably do so many fewer stents and these invasive procedures because you could actually get at it earlier. And so that's just one example of like what continuous monitoring, seeing a movie of what's happening, would really do.
And that can couple really well with like heart rate monitors we have, like even Aura Ring, just like identify if there's arrhythmia, if there's some form of irregular heart rate coupled with a troponin increase, like that could really solidify what's going to happen in the near future.
Totally. It's like what happened with COVID, with so many of these non-invasive wearables could predict that someone was starting to get COVID before they even have symptoms. And so just imagine, the sky is really the limit. I mean, think about the fertility industry. Like, we're spending billions on IVF and all these assisted reproductive technologies and things like that. And imagine if there were continuous hormonal monitoring that could, really help people understand like exactly when they're most fertile, or and then more broadly speaking, I'm so excited about the potential of even continuous glucose monitoring for fertility, because one of the leading causes of infertility right now is polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is fundamentally rooted in insulin resistance. So just on every layer, every level of healthcare, being able to see more spectrums of health and more continuous time series of trajectories of health will change everything in terms of both empowerment, but also prevention. And I think really cost savings, because when you prevent the catastrophic things from happening or the reactive things from what we have to do in healthcare, you save a lot of money. And so to me, that is the future of healthcare.
Interesting you mentioned fertility, because we discussed this yesterday when I was on Dr. Mindy Pelt's podcast, because I didn't know that ovaries are one of the organs that use a lot of energy and really have high density of mitochondria, because I brought up the fact that some studies show that the brain and the heart prefers to take up ketones, and because they are so mitochondrially active that they need that fuel to create ATP. And then she was like, now I wonder if women with fertility problems have low energy level in their ovaries, would they benefit from ketones? Now that's a very interesting area to look into as well.
It's such a great question. But I mean, I think for anyone of childbearing age, including myself, one of the biggest motivators for mitochondrial health is thinking about fertility, because there's just the ovaries. I believe, and I could be wrong about this, they have the highest density of mitochondria of any cell type in the body, and that makes sense. What could be more energy intensive than, right, like setting up? Well, I mean, it's a part of the body that's literally going through a massive change every single month. That's very energetically intense. And so if you are not protecting those mitochondria from the mitochondrial ravaging forces of our modern environment, of course there's going to be problems. And that's what we're seeing. Fertility rates are plummeting. Infertility rates are going up astronomically. Sperm count is down 50%. Some studies show that up to 26% of women have polycystic ovarian syndrome. Assisted reproductive technology we're doing like 200,000 procedures a year in the US. Like, why aren't we talking about the mitochondria? So yeah.
No, I love, Casey, I love talking to you. Like, I can talk to you for hours. Like, this could turn into a freaking Joe Rogan 3-hour conversation if we don't stop it ourselves. So I know you have a new book coming up. I want to quickly address that and share with our audience what your book is about, where can they find it, and where can they find you as well?
So for anything related to this conversation and more, I would check out levelshealth.com/blog. We've collaborated on some articles with H.V.M.N for this, and it's basically, I really feel like, and other than I will also plug the H.V.M.N blog, which is amazing, but really just like such high quality metabolic health education. So definitely check that out. Levels on Instagram and Twitter @Levels. And then of course, if people want to actually try Levels, there's the special offer with levels.link/HVMN, which gets you 2 months of free membership. And I'm personally at Dr. Casey's Kitchen on Instagram and Twitter. And my book is actually not coming out until next year, and so maybe we can have a longer conversation about that early next year, episode 2. Yeah, but it's called Good Energy, and it's about how we make energy in the body and why that's so important. So a lot of what we talked about today.
Amazing. So now, moment of truth. So if you remember, from the beginning of the episode, I measure my blood glucose. Casey measured her ketone levels. So now we've taken ketones for about almost an hour. Let's see what our levels are at.
Okay, I just pricked my finger again.
That was so quick.
I know. Let's see. Getting my little ketone strip open.
I think I broke the sense. Oh, it's 80. It dropped 9 points.
Okay, 10 seconds. Let's see what Keto Mojo has to say. I was at 0.2 to start.
Yep, 0.2. I want to say above 1.
1.4!
There you go.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah. It works. Ketone-IQ works.
Okay,
it tastes like it works.
I am blown away. It takes me like a 3-day fast to get to 1.4. I am so, that's incredible.
You've never measured your ketone level, even though you've been taking Ketone-IQ, you've never measured your ketone levels before?
No. I've never measured it this quickly after taking it. Like, cause I usually take my ketones every like morning, but I don't usually take it like an hour after I've taken, and I also usually take 1 shot instead of 2. And this is astounding to me.
Yeah, it works. It really puts you in ketosis. So it lowers glucose, increase your ketone levels, and give you energy. And a lot of people will also use it to actually augment their fast because it has a slight appetite suppression effect. And actually today I'm writing a brief on running a study on appetite suppression. So that is a sneak peek of what we are doing next at H.V.M.N.
Well, I was actually going to say that one of the key ways that I use Ketone-IQ is, oh my gosh, also I just have to mention, sorry, I'm all over the place. My glucose started at 96 and it went to 72.
Yep, it drops.
Yep. So that's amazing. But I will take the shot of Ketone-IQ usually at night around 9 p.m. because I tend to eat dinner around 6. I don't go to bed till midnight. And I usually get very hungry in the evening, and I used to snack, and that of course is not great for metabolic health. And a ketone shot will tide me over basically. And I think it actually also supports sleep.
Yeah. I mean, I take it before sleep, so it's very anecdotal at this point. But a lot of people swear by it, and some people, they feel like they're too energetic to go to bed. So I think give it a try for yourself and see what's best for you. And as we were talking all episode, everyone's body is very different. You know, what works for me may not work for you. And you might need to work on the other side of your metabolic health and your lifestyle aspect. And I need to work on the other sides.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This was so fun.
Thank you so much. This has been so fun, and time just flew by. Can't wait to meet you again and meet you in person and hang out. And thank you again for being on H.V.M.N podcast.